Hello, I'm Mike Ward, and welcome to Conversations in Healthcare, a video series brought to you by DRG, part of Clarivate. This series examines the healthcare ecosystem and its current business challenges and opportunities. In each episode, I'll be talking to key leaders and thought leaders in the industry, and about how they anticipate some of the challenges that they face and how they're navigating them. Currently, our series is focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic and the numerous challenges that it has actually unleashed on the industry. In line with this, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Dana Gheorghe. Dana is an Associate Director of DRG with extensive expertise forecasting drug markets for a wide range of oncology indications, including breast cancer, non-Hodgkin's and Hodgkin's lymphoma. And she's joining me today to talk about the impact that COVID-19 is having on the already available CAR T-cell therapies, Kymriah and Yescarta, as well as the ongoing development of other CAR T-cell therapies. Dana, I hope you're well, and those you care about are doing well too. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone to this conversation.
So Dana, what are the impacts that COVID-19 is actually having on these current cell therapies?
So obviously it's still a fluid situation. Things continue to change on a daily basis, but it's certainly this worldwide pandemic is having a huge effect on treatments that are available. So Kymriah and Yescarta being the two of them that are commercially available, and it's becoming more obvious that patient selection prior to therapy is of paramount importance. So deciding the treatment with the CAR T cells, physicians have to consider alternative therapies during pandemics and choose whether they want their patients to receive the CAR T cells or go to an alternative scenario where they could potentially give them other therapies until the situation improves, and then make the choice to go the CAR T cell route.
So how are patients being treated at the moment with these CAR T cells, and what are the actual challenges associated with COVID around those treatment regimens?
So we've seen, since it all started, we've seen changes in guidelines, updates of guidelines across the world. And physicians are being advised to consider very carefully the risk of the patients, the disease burden. So these two things are the major deciding factors when physicians have to decide whether to go for the CAR T cells or not. So if a patient could potentially receive other therapies apart from CAR T cells, guidelines encourage physicians to go this route. If, however, the disease burden of the patient doesn't allow them, and they're basically prime candidates for the CAR T cells, and it's in a way their last resort, then that's the way to do it. Patients have to be super carefully screened for risk, so for risks associated with their disease. They need to be tested. So the guidelines indicate that patients have to first self-isolate for at least 14 days prior to receiving the CAR T cells, then be tested multiple times before the treatment starts to make sure that they're not infected, and then receive the therapy. So all these steps were not in place before the pandemic started. So careful steps that need to ensure that patients are selected properly. Obviously, other considerations need to be accounted for. So we know that the side effects of CAR T cells are not the easiest ones. So in some cases, ICU beds are required for the patients receiving the CAR T cells. And as we know, the availability of ICU beds is becoming an issue, has been an issue for a while now. During the pandemic, staff availability in intensive care units is also quite a big problem. So all of these things need to be taken care of before the treatment started. There are the potential impacts, so not just the availability of the staff, but the way the patients are being monitored. CAR T-cell therapies, the treatment themselves require very, very careful monitoring of patients for side effects. Neurological side effects are particularly important. So the availability of specialized, highly trained nurses and physicians to take care of such patients is important. In some situations, these members of staff may have been redirected to work on the pandemic, so their availability might be limited. The hospital's willingness to carry out the treatment also needs to be accounted for. So some hospitals may not be open for CAR T-cell therapies or even stem cell transplants because of the high risks associated with such procedures. Many things that could go wrong, they need to be accounted for. Drug shortages, so for example, supportive therapies that are required as part of the treatment. These all need to be made sure that they're there and patients have access to them.
So, and I mean, the supply chain is clearly an issue, and these products, these cell therapies are, it's a not trivial exercise to manufacture them. So, have we sort of seen any sort of disruption to that process, or how are the companies ensuring that they can provide continuity of supply?
Well, so far there's limited information as to how the companies are coping with this, but from what they have made available, it seems that they are trying to maintain the supply chain going. So they've found, obviously there are air travel restrictions in place, and if cells, for example, need to be sent to a remote location to be processed and then sent back for the patient to receive them, that could be an issue. But we know companies such as Novartis have said to their investors and to their patients that they found alternative routes for these cells to reach the labs or reach the patients. So while the information is relatively scarce, we know that companies are doing their best to maintain the flow going.
So you mentioned how these clinicians are having to sort of make a judgment on whether or not they keep the patients on the sort of CAR T-cell therapy track or not. Do we have a sort of a sense of what proportion of patients would actually be in that super high risk group?
Well, we know that the two therapies available, Yescarta and Kymriah, are available for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma patients and also for ALL. So ALL tends to be a disease associated with young people, while NHL is associated with the elderly population. One would assume that the elderly population would be at risk of becoming infected with COVID-19 and be more affected by the infection. So I think when it comes to the patient choice, and whether they go for the treatment or not, the age of the patients will be definitely a deciding factor.
Yeah.
If their disease burden is also quite heavy and they've run out of options, then the risk is then carefully assessed again. And if physicians decide that they can withstand the toxicity of the treatment and the potential risks associated with it, then they may go ahead and do it. But I think the patient selection, as I said before, it was important before, but now it's absolutely crucial to be done in a careful way.
So also, I mean, these are very, very relatively new products. They've only just recently been approved, and there's quite a lot of activity still in the sort of the clinical trial space. So whereas if you're treating patients, one can sort of see that there is it's important to keep going. What sort of disruption are we seeing in the clinical trial arena?
So there are lots of clinical trials ongoing, or were before the pandemic started, involving not necessarily new CAR T-cells, but also the ones that are already approved and are seeking label expansions in other indications or other disease settings. The development of such therapies is huge at the moment because of the hype surrounding their efficacy, and obviously this has been massively impacted. So we are seeing clinical trials delayed or suspended because of patient recruitment issues. So companies, for example, Bristol Myers Squibb, in April, they decided that no new clinical trial sites for CAR T-cells for cell therapy treatments should be initiated in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this remains in place. So there was another company announcement second week of May indicating that that decision remains in place. However, in a letter to clinical trial investigators, BMS indicated that where a hold was in place for clinical trials, they could potentially restart, but only if a whole list of conditions was to be met. So these conditions were not only country-specific or region-specific, such as relaxation of lockdowns, but also it was a very comprehensive list. So patient selection, meeting certain criteria, availability of ICU beds. So it's an ongoing process. Companies are aware of what's happening. They're really careful when it comes to designing their clinical trials. For ongoing trials, so trials that have been recruiting patients up to now, some have seen holds and then restarts, depending probably on the local situation, on how the patients reacted to the conditions made available for them. the impact, it's going to delay a lot of these studies. So the pandemic is definitely going to have an impact. We're seeing primary readouts of clinical trials being extended by up to 2 years in certain situations. This could be because patient recruitment was stopped, so they won't be able to accrue enough patients to gather enough data. Monitoring of the patients may not be available or not as tight as it should be to meet regulatory requirements. This will then have a downward effect when it comes to the companies filing for approval or for line expansions or label expansions of the drugs. Obviously, data accrual and how it's done, and all the conditions that need to be met from a regulatory perspective may be impacted. So it's still a bit unknown how this will play out in, say, 5 years' time or even shorter than that. But we're definitely seeing an immediate effect on how clinical trials are being organized now.
Right. And of course, that's, knowing what we now know, one of the challenges is that when the lockdowns are relieved, that there could be, a second wave of coronavirus, or this could in fact be sort of seasonal. So have you got an idea or a sense of what companies are doing or what they need to do to cope with that potential known unknown?
Well, it's difficult to say, but I think one of the most crucial things will be testing and increasing the testing rates of patients, either going into clinical trials or going for treatment with cell therapies, knowing whether they're positive or negative. So I think multiple testing will definitely have to be done prior to any therapy. Patients will have to be carefully selected, their comorbidities assessed in great detail to understand the potential risks. And yeah, availability of staff. So I don't know whether hospitals will have this possibility, but potentially hiring more staff to deal with a second burst of infections whilst treatments are ongoing. That could be a temporary solution or permanent. Obviously, the availability of PPE, this should also be taken into account. Lots of things that could be done in terms of patient selection. But for now, I think it's really important to understand what the effect on the organism this virus has. The more we know, then the more we're likely to respond in a better way. So all of this information will have to be made available to all treating physicians, be it ones that are specialized in CAR T-cells or stem cell transplants, so they understand what to expect, when to expect it, and how to deal with it in the best possible way.
Right. So, CAR T-cell therapies, it's a sort of a new way to treat patients, and it has created a lot of excitement in the industry. We've seen a lot of effort. Do you sort of think that the issues, the complications, sort of the barriers that COVID is throwing up might actually sort of dampen the enthusiasm that others might have for jumping into the sort of the CAR T-cell space, or for clinicians to sort of also engage with CAR T-cell therapies?
I don't think so. They have shown tremendous benefits for certain patients. We're seeing really good efficacy, especially in the heavily pretreated patient populations. There is hope that they will start working in solid tumors as well, so not just in heme malignancies. So there's definite promise of these therapies, and I think this will tip the balance in favor of them. Physicians have been getting used to to side effects or associated toxicities of therapies for years, if we're thinking of chemotherapies or other therapies. So something like COVID coming along and increasing the risk of side effects or increasing the risk of patients getting more complications during treatment, I think physicians will not be put off by that. I think it's the promise of the therapies that will keep them going.
So, and what would you sort of say would therefore the key lessons that we've learned through this sort of this COVID experience around CAR T-cell therapies?
I think the most important one, and I've seen most companies developing CAR T-cells have done it, is tread carefully. Put a clinical hold in place when you don't know what the situation is like or it's likely to happen. Look for signs of improvements or anything that could impact that therapy. Tread carefully. So monitor patients more closely. Make sure that all side effects are recorded and verified. Understand what the risks are and manage them in a careful way. Also, when we're thinking of air limitations like transporting the cells and so on, so find alternative routes that won't disrupt the supply chain. Avoid any contamination of cell products. Test. Obviously, if you have tests available. So make sure that everything that you do is done in a considerate way, in line with what the healthcare systems are telling you to do.
Finally, those observations that you just shared, how many of them do you think are just sort of temporary, just to get over this particular issue, and how many of them do you think actually might be sort of permanent shifts in behavior in a post-pandemic world?
Well, first of all, we don't know whether this virus will ever go away. So some of these things that we're seeing happening now may continue for the foreseeable future. So I think physicians will not readily go back to their ways of doing things once, let's say, the first peak passes, because we know a second one may follow it. So I think some of, if not most of these impacts will be seen for a very long time. It's just a way of how we're gonna manage them and how we'll learn to deal with them. That's the issue. But obviously it will be down to local healthcare units or country-specific regulations being put in place.
Dana, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today. The insights that you've shared, I'm sure that they'll be of great interest to the audience. If after listening to this broadcast, you've got any questions for either me or for Dana, please feel free to give us your feedback. You can sort of click on the link and send us your questions. That would be great. And also, if you would actually like to be informed of future episodes, again, you can go to the LinkedIn page where we will be communicating the release of future episodes. So again, I'd like to thank Dana for joining us. I'd also, on behalf of myself and Clarivate and DRG, also say a big thank you to all of you who are involved in actually tackling this pandemic and bringing care and help to patients. The work you do is absolutely important. So Dana, thanks once again for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.